もし、ウクライナを本当の意味で破壊したのは、ロシアではなく EU だとしたら、もし、その EU がヨーロッパ自体を破壊しているとしたら、あなたは信じますか？そして、そんなヨーロッパに追随してる日本の政府とメディアって何？ 2026 年、世界は大きく変わります。
Because the people who have pursued certain policies under the name of standing with Ukraine are the ones who have destroyed it.
I think NATO expansion has always been the core problem in this, but for the last few years, anybody that would say that was immediately dismissed in Western media, right? You would be labeled as a Putin apologist, you would be criticized for carrying the Kremlin lines and basically, Russian propaganda.
And because our political leaders, of course, they set up the war. And so what key narrative do you need? Well, you have to say this was unprovoked. This was at the core of our propaganda, because once you accept that this was unprovoked, suggesting this is just a Russian military opportunism, that one day they woke up and wanted some more territory. The EU is just destroying Europe for many reasons: the economy, the demographics, the reproduction of its culture and civilization. This is what you see in the new national security strategy of the United States.
Do you think that a dismantling of the European Union, is that something that could potentially be on the table for the future? Do you see that actually happening?
2026年、世界に大転換が起これば、日本も間違いなくその波に飲み込まれるでしょう。長期化するロシアとウクライナとの戦争。しかし、その内情は欺瞞と偽善に満ちたものでした。今回の動画では、ノルウェーの国際政治学者グレン・ディーセン教授が、ヨーロッパの避けられない未来を語ってくれています。彼はロシア・ウクライナ戦争を研究してきた欧州で最も信頼できる論者の一人であり、真実、透明性、理性的思考の重要性を訴えてきた人物です。なぜ戦争は長期化したのか、なぜ外交という選択肢がいつの間にか消えていったのか、そしてヨーロッパの人々はどんな前提を信じ込まされてきたのか、そうした問いを日本を含む西側メディアではほとんど語られてこなかった視点から私たちに突きつけます。高市政権はウクライナに対し、新たに約9000億円の追加支援を決めました。しかしその支援理由として語られたのは、EU が主張していることをそのままコピーしただけに過ぎないものでした。したがって、日本も無関係ではいられません。エネルギーのほとんどを海外に依存し、かつてはロシアとも現実的な関係を保ってた日本。しかしウクライナ戦争後、ロシアからは非友好国扱いされ、結果としてその選択肢は狭まってきました。この動画は、事の善悪を押し付けるものではありません。国の存続という現実的な問題として、果たして日本はこれからどう振る舞うべきなのか、日本の立ち位置を考えるきっかけになればと思っています。新しい年の始まりに、遠い話ではなく、身近な問題としてこの動画を見ていただければ幸いです。それでは、どうぞ。
As European leaders continue to make decisions that go against their best interests and prolong a war that should have ended many years ago. We are at a pivotal time in history, and today's conversation is one of the best discussions on the truth of what's happening in Ukraine and what it means for the future of Europe. Let's begin.
All right. Well, everyone, I'm very honored to welcome back into the studio Professor Glenn Diesen from Norway. He is one of the best insiders into the Russia-Ukraine war, but also all things related to Europe. And we are really coming at you at a very pivotal time in Europe's relationship. We see the continuation of this war in Ukraine, is really coming to a tipping point, I feel, and even a bigger story, I think, is the fraction of the United States and European relationship. Professor, welcome to the studio. I'm so excited for today's chat.
Oh, thank you for having me back. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Professor Diesen, Europe has now frozen Russian assets and is discussing using them as collateral to fund Ukraine, repayment only if Russia loses. From a legal and geopolitical perspective, has Europe crossed a point of no return here?
Yeah, no, well, they've gone to a great extent, to take this money. But it has to be said that they weren't able to get a consensus within, so they had to agree on some $90 billion loan guaranteed by the member states, because there's a lot of European countries who fear this, then primarily the Belgium, because Euroclear is in Belgium.
ユーロクリアとは、ベルギーに本拠を置く世界最大級の証券決済機関のことです。ロシア中央銀行の外貨 資産の多くがここで保管されており、ウクライナ侵攻後、欧米の制裁により凍結されています。
So if they take the money, they will be liable. And as Euroclear suggests, the lawyers from Belgium, that this is not legal. So they recognize in themselves this is illegal. You can't just seize the sovereign funds of another state. It doesn't make any sense. Again, I think it should be common sense, but for anyone following Europe, all the language is very normative. They only speak in this language of, oh, well, this is the right thing to do. It's just Russians have caused much damage in Ukraine now. It's only right that they pay for it. Again, these are good sounding normative arguments, but in reality, if we all started to do this with each other, everyone starts seizing American assets around the world because, to repatriation for any of those wars, or seize the funding of the Europeans, which also go to war every now and then. There's no international financial system anymore. Everything collapses. And this is, again, why the EU would actually destroy itself if it goes down this path.
ここで語られているのは、いわゆる正義という大義名分のためなら手段を選ばない民主主義の放棄とも取れる EU の大いなる自己矛盾の話です。
It's also destroying itself in another way. That is because it's now bullying its different members. Keep in mind that when they froze this money, the reason why the countries voted to freeze it within the EU is that they would be allowed to vote on it every 6 months, whether or not they should still keep the sanctions in place. Now the EU just said, well, we have emergency powers. There will be no more voting, now frozen indefinitely until everyone agrees to release it. That means this stealing the assets of Russia can only be undone if you have countries like Estonia agreeing to it. I mean, it's quite wild, and I think part of the purpose here is to freeze, to perpetuate the war as well, because they say we're not going to give their money back to Russia, even if there's a peace agreement. That's the recent proposal they came with. It doesn't entail giving Russia's money back. I think this is just, very destructive at its core.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the interesting thing here in the U.S. media, what we were able to see is that, we see this headline saying that there's a huge unity from Europe. Everyone has frozen these assets and they're going to move forward. But all of a sudden, there was the big move from Belgium, who obviously said, wait a second, we're going to be on the hook for this. And, like you said, it certainly is going to undermine the credibility of really the whole foundation, that Europe stands for. And I like your point there, right? If we don't have these rules in place, then it's just chaos, right? We don't live in a functional society. What does this tell us about the state of Europe right now? Is this really revealed to us just how fragile this European Union is currently?
No, it's very weak, and I think that's part of the reasons why it is so irrational. And just on one point on the irrationality, the whole argument they're making, so we'll get this money back because we will not let any war end without the Russians paying reparations. That means they have to hand over the money. Well, you don't get to dictate the terms in a war that you lost, and we lost this war. It's just reality of the matter. But again, the normative language again continues. That is, well, it's not the right thing, it's not this and that, but nobody cares. If you lost the war, you don't get to dictate the terms. So there's nothing that makes sense here. But I think you mentioned the weakness of the EU, but it's not just internally how the different members are going after each other. Keep in mind when the Belgians suggested, well, we can't do this because this will destroy a country. Immediately you see the headlines come up in Politico. Belgium is Putin's most important assets. So this is what we do to each other. We do it against entire countries, politicians, journalists, academics. Whoever doesn't fall in line is just shamed and attempted to be humiliated or weakened or destroyed. It's quite aggressive. But I think at the heart of the whole thing is that Europeans don't really see a future for themselves anymore. That is what happens now in the multipolar world. If we would have defeated the Russians, we could have built up a 100,000 strong Ukrainian army that would function as a deterrent against Russia and a shield against the Russians. It would have cemented the American presence in Europe. We could have maintained the US-Europe partnership. The Americans would be a pacifier so the Europeans don't turn on each other. It would also have made us relevant in the future. But we're not winning, we lost, and that has profound consequences. That is that the US recognizes that it's a multipolar world. In a multipolar world, it can't be everywhere. So you have to prioritize. That is Americas, Asia, So if you pivot there, you have to pivot away from somewhere, and they want to pivot away from Europe. So we don't really have any good answers now. Now Russia will have a seat at the table in Europe. We can't ignore its security concerns anymore. The Americans will deprioritize Europe because why would they, they want to pivot away from Europe. Then they have to gradually pull out, but also they don't want to even join in the newest national security strategy. They even make it clear that they don't want any more NATO expansion, which also makes sense. That would only deepen America's commitment to Europe, and it would push Russia closer to China. And China's the main competitor for the US. So none of this makes any sense anymore. So for the US, it makes perfect sense to say, well, we lost this war, let's counter our losses and hand it over to the Europeans. But Europe is going to be in a very bad shape after this war.
Professor, can you give us an update really on where we stand in the war? I mean, this war obviously did not start 3 years ago. I mean, this conflict can really, really maybe its origin and its roots goes back to the fall of the Soviet Union is kind of really where the start of these many problems between Russia and Ukraine started. But we certainly, I think almost everybody, whether you're for Ukraine or, Russia, I mean, everyone is almost coming to the same conclusions. But what's happening on the battlefield right now? Can you give us some updates and, where we are in this current phase of the war?
Yeah, sure. If we can just have a quick comment, because you said also stand with Ukraine, because that's also very, let's call it a loaded term, because the people who have pursued certain policies under the name of standing with Ukraine are the ones who have destroyed it. Like for people like me who for the past 20 years warned, for God's sake, don't try to pull Ukraine into NATO, Ukraine will be destroyed. This has been presented as taking an anti-Ukrainian position. My policy recommendations would have made sure that there wouldn't have been a war. Even Crimea would still have been Ukrainian. And I think, this goes back, as you said, the beginning, at the end, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine. Anyways, over to the battlefield. Again, the media has been very dishonest. They portray this in the tradition of maneuver warfare. They look at only the map. Oh, look how little the map has changed in Russia's favor. They were not winning, obviously not. They pay a high price and they take in very little territory. In reality, this is a war of attrition in which the territory comes at the end. I also make the point, why would the Russians storm heavily fortified Ukrainian positions, which is, they have the trenches, they're well-trained, well-armed. Then you would take massive casualties. Well, a war of attrition is essentially who can bleed out the other side first. So you don't waste your manpower and equipment to take territory. Again, it's not about territory. That's a symptom or a consequence. So what you've seen through the war now is almost month by month that attrition rates go increasingly in Russia's favor. The Ukrainians have a massive manpower problem now. They're losing so many men on the front line. They don't have proper equipment anymore. The Russians are dominating with artillery now, with drones, of course, with air power, with all this glide bombs. And all of this is now creating new problems. That is, they have, again, not just manpower shortage, but morale is dropping, which means it's harder to recruit. Yes, they can have more brutal recruitment tactics, but this only fuels dissent in society. And also you force people to the front line. Well, then you're going to have mass desertion, and desertion is just exploding. And this has further consequences, because if people are fleeing the battlefield, now it's easier for the Russians to punch through different places, surround large groups of troops and destroy them. So once you have one problem, everything begins to fall apart. And you see this with the military force, the economic, but also international support. As Ukraine is losing the war, as I said before, who wants to, bet on the losing horse? So the Americans are now pulling out and they're repositioning themselves as some kind of a mediator, trying to bring the Europeans and Ukrainians and Russians together. So no, I think everything is unraveling very quickly. I have a hard time believing that this war will go beyond 2026, but of course I could be wrong on this.
Right. Well, I think what's interesting right now is we're starting to see even some senior officials in the United States, start to admit the truth. Last week there was a very viral video clip that was, had surfaced, and it was from Amanda Sloat, who was the director of Europe under Joe Biden's administration. She basically had overseen, the foreign policy in Europe under the Biden administration, and she had now come to the conclusion, I admitted this in a podcast, basically stating that, at the time in early 2022, we had actually floated out the idea that if Ukraine would not join NATO, that we could potentially avoid a war, altogether. But ultimately, we decided to push them in the direction of fighting back.
I mean, look, the NATO question has always been difficult. We had some conversations even before the war started about what if Ukraine comes out and just says to Russia, fine, we won't go into NATO if that stops the war, if that stops the invasion, which at that point it may well have done. There is certainly a question almost 3 years on now, would that have been better to do before the war started? Would that have been better to do in Istanbul talks? It certainly would have prevented the destruction and the loss of life.
I think NATO expansion has always been the core problem in this, but for the last few years, anybody that would say that was immediately dismissed in Western media, right? You would be labeled as a Putin apologist, you would be criticized for carrying the Kremlin lines and basically, Russian propaganda. And so I think we're starting to see this unravel a little bit, even here in the United States, where people are finally waking up to the truth of the blunders that we have certainly led Ukraine down and the blunders in our own foreign policy.
Yeah, well, I think this is because this war has been going on two tracks. That is on the battlefield, but also there's been a war of narratives. And because our political leaders, of course, they set up the war, a permanent, like a long war. This is what Zelensky said back in March of 2022. That is that there's many in the West, several Western countries who would like for this to be a long war. And they made the point that this would, even if this come at expense of the destruction of Ukraine, because these Western countries see this as an opportunity to weaken Russia with Ukrainians. This was with an interview with the Economist, by the way. So the narrative is quite important. Now, if you want a long war with Russia, what do? Well, first, you sabotage the peace agreement in Istanbul, which was in the beginning of 2022, which was done. And then, of course, you don't want any diplomatic settlement. So the Europeans and Americans, they cut all diplomatic ties. They stopped talking to Russia. The EU foreign policy chief announced this will be resolved on the battlefield. And so what key narrative do you need? Well, you have to say this was unprovoked. This was at the core of our propaganda, because once you accept that this was unprovoked, suggesting this is just Russian military opportunism, that one day they woke up and wanted some more territory. Well, under such circumstances, you can't make any compromises, because any compromise will be appeasement. It will only embolden and reward the Russians for their aggression. So the only thing we can do is pump in as much weapons as possible to elevate the cost as opposed to the benefits they will gain. So this is why you also saw only weapons being poured in and no diplomacy. This is a logical conclusion from this narrative of being unprovoked. But also, as you said, this narrative is resting on nothing. It's ridiculous. I mean, we had top Western leaders throughout the 90s recognizing NATO expansion would be seen as a threat by Russia. In 2008, when we promised NATO membership, you had the CIA director William Burns saying that this was the reddest of all lines. This would likely trigger a civil war and a direct Russian intervention. You had Angela Merkel saying, well, if we try to get Ukraine into NATO, this will be interpreted as a declaration of war. So this is nonsense. We knew all this stuff. This is why we had to censor all dissent, because we were going for a long war. So anyone who said that NATO expansion might be the source of this conflict, well, then you have a political solution. This doesn't go down well with our long war narrative. So this is Russian propaganda. Anyone who's suggesting that Zelensky is not Churchill 2.0 or that there's corruption there, but they're also Russian propagandists. There's no corruption in Ukraine. If you said that the British and Americans sabotaged the Istanbul peace agreement, more Russian propaganda. And of course, Ukraine is losing the war. Well, then you are undermining the public support for the war. So this is also Russian propaganda. The sanctions aren't working. Well, that's also Russian propaganda. And you're just trying to undermine trust and public support for sanctions. So all dissent, no matter how well-founded the argument is, and now we know all these things, but one after another, what was censored and smeared as Russian propaganda, all of it's been proven true. So there's a legitimacy crisis, I think, now brewing across the political West about the lies we told in order to keep this war going, that is going for a long war.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're starting to see the truth come out. And, interesting enough, Bloomberg just reported a few hours ago that French President Emmanuel Macron says that Europe will have to find a way to directly engage with the Russian leader as the U.S. pushes ahead with peace talks. And I think that's a very interesting, headline there because, it's just a few hours after the EU failed to agree on how to use these Russian frozen assets, realizing that they're going to have to fund Ukraine themselves. And now, I guess now they realize that maybe diplomacy, they're going to have to find a way to work with Russia. And I think that's probably a logical conclusion because geographically, obviously, Russia's not going anywhere. It's always going to border Europe. There's always, you're going to have to find a way to work with the Russians at some point because, peaceful coexistence has to happen in the future. But that's quite a bold statement from the French president. Is that something that I think more European leaders are going to have to realize and start to acknowledge?
Yeah, I think so, because, this is the end of the line. As I said, we lost it. But it also shouldn't be surprising that it's Macron, because after the Russians invaded, he was the only European leader who still tried to talk to Putin and find something. But again, he was also shamed heavily by politicians as well as the Western media that, we're supposed to isolate Putin, don't talk to him. This is, by the way, what the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, brags about that, we don't talk to Russia because, Putin's a war criminal. We don't talk to war criminals. And she prides herself of encouraging other countries also to break off diplomacy. You have to understand, this is in the minds of the European leaders and our media. This was a sign of morality and virtue that while hundreds of thousands of young men died in the trenches, that they boycotted diplomacy. They didn't want to talk to Russia because this is goodness. But no, I think the European position has become way too awkward. That is, they demand to have a seat at the table in negotiations, yet they don't want to talk to Russia. So this is a very strange contradiction. So you end up in this situation, which is just pure comedy, which is over the past 4 years, they have all these peace summits where they meet from Denmark to Saudi Arabia, but they don't invite the Russians. So they just sit there and talk about how evil Russia is, how we can send more weapons, how wonderful it would be if Russia would break up to many countries. I mean, it's obscene, and you see the same now. The Europeans are negotiating with Zelensky and the Americans in Berlin. This is not negotiations. It's just sitting at the table with people you already agree with. It doesn't make any sense at all. So again, it's not the Russians who broke off diplomacy. The Europeans did. The Americans did back in 2022. These Europeans can pick up the phone at any time and call Moscow. As President Putin made clear, they didn't cut off diplomacy. If the Europeans call, why wouldn't you talk to them? No, there has to be some correction. But we dug ourselves so deeply into these false narratives, all this insane, crazy hatred of the Russians. Yeah, there's very little room for maneuver. So I think hopefully that's what Macron is referring to now, trying to give ourselves some more space to actually pursue our interests, which can't be to fight the losing war.
Professor, I want to talk a little bit now about specifically Europe's relationship with the United States. I think we've seen over the last few months, certainly the United States and Donald Trump mainly, really moving away from Europe. I mean, there's been a lot of reports saying this transatlantic partnership that has lasted, for many, many decades, really after the fall of, or the conclusion of World War II. Obviously Europe and America have always been close allies, but specifically this year, I think in 2025, we've seen a fracturing of the relationship. I think that we've seen a retreat from the United States. I want to get your opinion as a European and how you're looking at the United States and how you're looking at Donald Trump and the U.S. foreign policy. What is the future of Europe's relationship with the United States? And, how do you feel as a European, looking at this future relationship?
Well, I think it's going to have to be transformed fundamentally. I think we're heading towards growing tensions between if not the conflict, not armed conflict, but conflict conflict between the United States and Europe. And it doesn't have to be, but I do think that unless we define our relationship away from the past, we're going to end up in a very angry, abusive marriage. I think we need a nice divorce so we can be good neighbors instead. And I say this because the foundation of the relationship has changed. Keep in mind that, many people want to attribute everything to Donald Trump, but the American pivot to Asia was announced by Obama. I forget the exact date, but it was President Obama who announced it to somewhere. You have to pivot away from somewhere, and that would be from Europe. Why would the United States pivot to Asia? Well, they recognize the rise of Asia. So this is quite important. So I think you have to see how the relationship was in the past, what was the foundation for the solidarity, why their national interests were overlapping to such an extent, and why this is no longer the case. Because the political West really came together after World War II. Again, you had the bipolar world order, you had two centers of power, two mutually exclusive and competitive ideologies, and this kind of formed the foundation for Western solidarity, common opposition, and the defense from the Soviet bloc. And then, of course, this was good for unity. At least Europeans benefited greatly. We had very generous trade agreements from the US. They helped to rebuild Europe. All of these good things. They subsidized their security. Then, of course, came the uncertainty after the Soviet Union went away. That is, if we're no longer faced with a Soviet threat, what should unite us? So we came up with a new mission, essentially, which is, collective hegemony. We can be America's junior partner in this unipolar moment. And this was the general idea. Now, in this system, the US would still be committed to Europe. It would still invest in our security. And so it made sense to a large extent. Now, the unipolar moment, this is why we expanded NATO, for example. We needed a new purpose for NATO. This isn't a conspiracy theory either. This is what NATO was officially saying. We need a new purpose to exist, so we have to expand, have out-of-area missions, which means interventionism, and this became the foundation of unity in the unipolar moment. But, sorry for the long-winded answer, but my point is, when you come to a multipolar world, what happens then? Well, now you have many centers of power. What do you do if you're the United States? If you have the rise of, China and Asia as the main region, you can't be everywhere anymore. Well, now you have to make priorities. So you want to focus on Americas, which is your own backyard, and you want to look at Asia, where China is. But Europe is certainly not a high priority anymore. So why would you commit yourself further to NATO expansion? It doesn't make any sense. It would only deepen America's commitment in Europe, and it would alienate the Russians and push them in the arms of the Chinese. So none of this suddenly makes any sense at all. And I think this is what you see in the new national security strategy of the United States. They say, no more NATO expansion. There's no harsh words against the Russians at all, which the Europeans were angry. On the contrary, though, the Europeans were scolded very heavily because they used the word civilizational erasure. That is, the EU is destroying Europe for many reasons: the economy, the demographics, the reproduction of its culture and civilization. So, but this kind of makes sense. Of course, they don't have to use these, crude terms, but overall, in a multipolar world, our interest goes in different ways.
Core 5という言葉を聞いたことがありますか？これはアメリカ政府が公式に発表した外交戦略の名称ではありません。しかし近年、アメリカの外交安全保障を分析する専門家や、リアリズム思考の戦略論の中で、アメリカは世界をこのように見始めているのではないかという文脈で語られるようになった、非公式ながら極めて示唆的な概念です。コア5とは、価値観や理念の近さではなく、人口規模、軍事力、経済力、資源、そして地政学的位置、こうした冷徹な現実の力を基準に、アメリカが無視できない中核国家をおおむね5つに絞って捉える思考枠組みを指します。そこに含まれると考えられているのは、アメリカ、中国、ロシア、インド、そして日本です。重要なのは、これは仲の良い国のリストでも、同盟国の序列でもないという点です。そして、このコア5という概念には、ヨーロッパは含まれていません。最大の理由は、ヨーロッパがもはや一つの意思決定主体として世界秩序を動かす力を持っていないとみなされつつあるからです。コア5からヨーロッパが外れているという事実は、アメリカが世界を価値観の連合ではなく、力の均衡で捉え直しつつあることを静かに物語っています。
Europe's no longer a priority. And the idea that the US should subsidize Europe when America's struggling to compete with China already, it doesn't make any sense at all. You get this leaked report from the United States that it considers it would like to, break up the EU. And it sees what it calls MAGA allies, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Poland, which should be pulled out of the European Union because they're better as independent sovereign states. And this also is consistent with national security strategy, in which the US says it will cultivate opposition within the EU, because by opposing the EU, they can save European civilization. This is the general idea.
ここで語られているように、アメリカは EU という枠組みの内部に生じている亀裂に目を向け、独自のアプローチを見せ始めています。ハンガリー、ポーランド、イタリア、これらの国々は移民政策、文化問題、国家主権のあり方をめぐって、EU の中央集権化や規範主義、左傾化した思想に強い違和感を示してきました。また、言論統制の動きも大きくなってきていると言われています。そこでいわゆるマガ的価値観、すなわち国境、主権、国家の決定権を重んじる姿勢と親和性を持つ国々と直接向き合える関係を築くというものです。
And thank you for those insights into the minds of Europe and, what's going to go on for the future. You brought up an interesting point. I mean, potential countries leaving the EU. Do you think that a dismantling of the European Union, is that something that could potentially be on the table for the future? Do you see that actually happening, the EU unraveling and more countries, trying to go independent?
Oh, no, that's my assumption pretty much. The EU it has a purpose, and there's some good reasons why one would support the EU, and that is it's a geo-economic bloc. It allows 27 member states, small, medium-sized countries to come together for collective bargaining power. So it can have a lot of weight in its own neighborhood. It can try to have some parity with the US, which it had 20 years ago, not anymore. And even stand a little bit of equal footing with the Chinese. Ideally, this is, have more symmetry in relations. This is a general idea. But the EU no longer delivers on clear economic interests for its member states. Indeed, when by cutting themselves off from Russia, increasingly China, alienating the Indians, and now also setting themselves up against the Americans, they're becoming a bit of a burden for the European Union. So the EU is becoming, it's not beneficial anymore. So I think this is the problem. Ursula von der Leyen calls it geopolitical Europe, which suggests that the new purpose of the EU is to collectively confront or balance Russia. The problem is, if this is the mission of Europe, then it's not able to deliver economic interests anymore. And because we need the Russian energy, we need all this stuff in order to be able to have a prosperous continent. And without it, it appears that the only thing that keeps unity in Europe is shared hatred of Russia. This isn't going to last. So it's a very poor foundation. So I think that, plus as the United States leaves as a pacifier, the European interest will also begin to diverge more. Again, there's no common economic, foreign policy, security interest between Greece, Latvia, Ireland, very different countries with different interests. So trying to force everyone common policy on everyone, this deepening of integration, I think that's going to have some big consequences.
いかがだったでしょうか。バイデン政権からトランプ政権に代わり、アメリカにはしごを外されたという側面はあるものの、EU は今、自らの構造的弱点と欺瞞が招いた結果として、苦境に立たされています。イタリアなど、価値観や意思決定をめぐって分裂の動きも見せ始めている中、日本がこれまでの物語通り、ウクライナへの追加支援を決定したことは極めて皮肉な状況です。世界が多極化し、時代が思想ではなく力の均衡へと移行しつつある中で、日本だけがかつての前提に立ったまま行動している。コア5の視点に立てば、日本は中核国になり得る立場にあります。しかし、それには条件があります。それは自らの判断と論理で行動すること。追随ではなく選択。惰性ではなく戦略。今、日本が問われているのは、支援するかしないかではありません。なぜそうするのかを、自らの言葉で語れる国であるかどうかです。もしかしたらこの局面は、世界から静かに試されている瞬間なのかもしれません。ご視聴ありがとうございました。